Yes, thank you, Mr. President. I rise in support of the bill. I am very thankful that we are hearing this bill tonight. I know that this is something that we've had long and detailed discussions on in public health and something that we tried to address in the previous sessions. And I just wanted to start by talking to folks about the first time that I really learned about PTSD. And it was when my father, who's now in his 80s, had described what it was like to be a little boy when his uncle, who was my grandfather's brother, came home after World War II. And his brother was a bomber pilot and spent quite a bit of time overseas, obviously, and came back from the war with what we would now classify as PTSD. And he described to us what it was like sometimes at holiday dinners where my Uncle Bill would maybe have a drink or two and then go into a state where he would be revved up, he would become a different person, and my father was told to go outside and to fill a sock with sand and to make sure that there was no rocks in it. And when my grandfather would have my father hand him the sock, he would twist it up and he would hit his brother in the back of the head to knock him out. That's how they dealt with PTSD or shell shock or whatever we might have called it back then, to knock him out, to have him sort of snap out of the state that he was in. And my father was a little boy remembering that. And years later, my mother's father, my grandfather, was a New York City fireman at the time right after World War II. And this was a time when there was probably not the building codes that we have here today. There was scattered electricity in many of the old, what they called tenement buildings. And my grandfather would tell us the stories about the fires that would happen in the city and how they would catch from building to building. This is the time before really protective gear. This was a time before any kind of smoke detectors or probably inspections as far as buildings. And he, to the day he died, would talk about the pride he had in being a fireman, the weight that he carried with him in carrying children from fires that had expired, that he couldn't save. Back then, they didn't have an ability to necessarily put the fires out as well as we can today, so there was times when they would have to just let it burn. But he told one story about the trauma that he had endured in his particular tenement building in New York City, where he had to carry 4 brothers out of a fire that had expired, and he detailed on carrying them and remembering the exact kind of shoes that they were wearing on the way out. And you could tell that he was someone that had carried this with him for 70 years. And back then, you weren't allowed to talk about your feelings. You weren't allowed to express any, sign of weakness. It was right after the war. And that has always stuck with me. Now we are fast-forwarding ahead here, and we're talking about PTSD, which is long overdue for our policemen, our firefighters, who we all, or at least I do, think of as our frontline heroes that we have every day. They put their lives on the line for us in ways that many of us cannot imagine. But I think that many of us who feel that they are heroes, they're everyday heroes, we also have to understand that they are human and that they have feelings, they have emotions, and that they suffer from what they see, whether it be one traumatic event or a cumulative exposure to very, very difficult and traumatic situations. These symptoms of PTSD, they can be clear and outward where we can all recognize them, or they can linger just below the surface and that they need a trigger for a state to be recognized that someone is suffering. So I wanted to go through some of the indicators of PTSD because I don't really think that's been touched upon. And one of the first things is the idea of reliving the moment, having dreams, having thoughts of seeing something over and over and over again. And it could be your traumatic event. It could be your exposure to multiple events. The second sign is avoiding situations that remind you of that event. You know, not talking about it, not being willing to share what's bothering you. Feeling numb. You're not interested in what you were interested before. The things that used to make you happy don't make you happy any longer. You're sort of immune, and you're starting to build a wall around yourself. There's also a feeling of being hyped up, hyper, keyed up. You're jittery, you have difficulty sleeping, you're on guard all the time. And common problems that we haven't really touched upon that come along with PTSD that is not cared for, it's not diagnosed, it's not something that people undergo treatment for, are things like drinking too much, fighting with your spouse, a feeling of hopelessness, depression, and sometimes drugs, and a true breakdown in relationships. So I think that treatment for PTSD is no more important than what we have crafted in this bill with a lot of input from so many. But there's no more important place than police and firemen and others that hopefully we'll talk about later today that are engaged in these split-second decisions that deal with life and death. They're fast-paced, they are ambiguous, and many times the people that are put in these positions have very limited or low information as far as what they're getting themselves into. When you're under those conditions, you can imagine what it must be like when you're suffering from PTSD on top of these very difficult positions that you're being put in. So I looked through the medical journals and through the NIH, and I found some interesting studies. One was done out of the University of Buffalo, and it actually looked at the brain function of people having to make life decisions, those that were not suffering from PTSD and those who were suffering from PTSD. And the results were quite remarkable. It was clear that someone suffering from PTSD who was not treated had a much more difficult time making the decisions that need to be made in those types of situations. And it was clear from the results that the best way to deal with PTSD is to try to not let it get to that level, to try to catch it before it gets to the level that I've just described, to be able to have proactive awareness of how important mental health is for all of us, whether you're a hero and you're a policeman, a hero and a firefighter, a hero and an EMS provider. It's important that you have the care that everyone else is entitled to, because your jobs are so different than anyone here in this circle, or many of us actually face on a daily basis. So I wanted to share with you of the many stories that I have received from policemen and firemen. Even hearing the stories is traumatic. But this one particular story is from a policeman who's not actually in my district, but he's a friend of ours. And he was called to the scene of an accident that today he still is in that reliving the moment. And this accident was actually at the home of a highly respected family that had 3 wonderful boys, and one of the boys had just come home from graduating from UConn. He had a degree in finance and I think accounting, and the whole world ahead of him. But him and his father loved cars, and he had an old BMW that used to be his father's from years ago, and his father had always taught him to change his own oil in the car. And the mom and dad were inside. It was not quite winter, but getting colder. And the son was in the garage, and he had the car up on the lift, and he was changing the oil. And it came to dinner time, and the mom said, "Can you go out and get so-and-so? Come on, it's time for dinner." And when the father went outside, what had happened was the car had slipped off of the lift and come down on this 21-year-old boy, and he died in the garage while the parents were in the house. And the police officer was called to the scene along with the EMS providers, and obviously the boy was transported to the local hospital, which at the time they did everything they could to try to save him, but he had been under the car for quite some time and was not going to recover. And the policeman had shared this story with me on how to this day with his own sons, he says, "I will not let my own sons change their oil. I will find the money and I will give them the money to get their oil changed someplace else," because that memory is so ingrained in him of what he saw. It was a young person, it was horrific, but not just the actual trauma of seeing this young man, it was the trauma of seeing the parents and having to console a father or a mother in an unconsolable situation, of having to break the news, "You don't want to see your son this way, let's get him to the hospital." And ironically, I heard about this story in a different way because my husband happened to be the doctor on call when this young man came in. And so I've heard this from different viewpoints, but the person who has really suffered the most has been the police officer who shared this with me. And he was not allowed to take time off in the state of Connecticut to maybe get the therapy or to be able to talk to somebody in a safe environment about what he saw and talk to somebody about how to deal with what he saw and how the impact of what he saw could change him in a way that to this day he said he will never get over. So I think that this bill does so much for the people who do so much for us that we take for granted every time we call 911 that someone's going to show up to help us. And I think that this is the least that we can do. We talk about how mental health is so important. It's part of our overall health. And I can't imagine another specialty, maybe beyond, an ER physician or somebody who's a trauma surgeon, that sees what these folks see on a daily basis. But they never know what they're getting into. They never know what the situation's going to be. So I would assume that they're on a heightened sense of anxiety as it is, just going to a particular scene. But then to come back from that scene and to try to go home to your family and just pretend it doesn't happen is something that I think we can all relate to, that's just not something that we can ask either our heroes or humans to do. They need a safe place, in a space where they're not going to be fearful that they're going to lose their jobs, because we wouldn't ask that of anyone else. So I am thrilled that we're talking about this today. I want to thank everybody who worked on this bill. I want to thank all the police officers and the firefighters for their service to our state and our country and our towns. I want to send a message to those who have suffered from PTSD and have not been able to get the help that they need, that I am someone who will stand firm with you, that I believe that you deserve this, and this is something that I hope this circle will pass, and I hope we'll get past the House, because As I said before, for me, you are our heroes, but you're human, and you deserve to be able to have something like PTSD recognized and taken care of. And when I've talked to my colleagues, or I've talked to friends that I know who are in the firefighting business, or are policemen or married to policemen, I was shocked to learn that about 50% of those in that first responder line of work, 50% of them suffer from some kind of either marital issues with divorce or drinking too much. It's the PTSD, everyone says, that's just under the surface that they have not been able to deal with. So when you feel that you have a sense where you can't talk, it's natural that you might say, I'm going to just have a drink. And then that could lead to something else. So let's provide them with something where they can feel comfortable before it gets to that point. And I fully support this bill. I'm hoping that we will be able to extend it to others also. And I look forward to its passage. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Summers. Will you remark further on the bill?